Captain Sarah Chun adjusted her helmet one final time as she walked across the tarmac toward her F-16 Fighting Falcon. The morning air was crisp, carrying the familiar scent of jet fuel and the distant rumble of engines warming up. Around her, male pilots prepared for the same mission, but their glances told a different story. Some looked skeptical, others dismissive, and a few couldn't hide their outright doubt about having a woman join their formation. Sarah had grown used to these looks over the past 3 years since graduating from flight school. At 28, she was one of only 12 female fighter pilots in the entire Air Force and the first woman assigned to the 442nd Fighter Squadron, known as the Steel Eagles. Her presence had caused quite a stir when she arrived 6 months ago, and despite her excellent training scores and flawless simulation records, many of her colleagues still questioned whether she belonged in a cockpit. "Chun, you sure you're ready for this?" called out Major Rick Harrison, the squadron's most experienced pilot and unofficial leader among the men. His tone wasn't entirely hostile, but it carried the weight of doubt that seemed to follow Sarah everywhere. "This isn't a training exercise. We're talking about real combat situations over hostile territory." Sarah turned to face him, her expression calm and professional. "I've been ready since day one, Major. My scores speak for themselves." She knew better than to show any emotion or defensiveness. In this world, any sign of weakness will be seized upon as proof that women didn't belong in fighter jets. The mission briefing had been clear. Intelligence reported enemy aircraft movements near the border, and their squadron was tasked with patrol duties that could quickly turn into active engagement. It was exactly the kind of assignment Sarah had trained for, yet she could feel the weight of expectations pressing down on her shoulders. Not just the expectation to perform well, but to prove that women could handle the pressure of real combat. As she conducted her pre-flight checks, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in a small farming town in Kansas, she had always looked up at the sky with wonder. Her father, a mechanic at the local airport, had taken her to air shows since she was 5 years old. While other girls her age played with dolls, Sarah built model airplanes and dreamed of soaring through the clouds. The path hadn't been easy. When she announced her intention to become a fighter pilot after high school, her guidance counselor had gently suggested she consider becoming a flight attendant instead. "It's more suitable for young ladies," the woman had said with a patronizing smile. Even her own mother had worried about her daughter choosing such a dangerous and male-dominated career. But Sarah's determination had been unshakable. She excelled in college, studying aeronautical engineering while maintaining a perfect GPA. When she applied for pilot training, she faced interview panels that seemed more interested in testing her resolve than her qualifications. Questions about whether she could handle the physical demands, whether she might get pregnant and waste their training investment, and whether she could work effectively with male colleagues had been par for the course. Flight school had been another challenge entirely. While her instructors were professional and fair, Sarah quickly learned that she had to be twice as good as her male classmates to receive half the recognition. When she made a mistake, it was seen as evidence that women weren't cut out for flying. When her male classmates made the same errors, it was just part of the learning process. Despite these obstacles, Sarah had graduated second in her class, with outstanding marks in both flying ability and tactical knowledge. Her instructor, Colonel Williams, had pulled her aside after the ceremony. "Chun, you're one of the best natural pilots I've seen in 20 years of teaching. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But remember, you're going to face challenges that have nothing to do with your ability to fly. Stay focused on the mission and let your skills do the talking." Those words echoed in her mind now as she completed her checks and prepared for takeoff. The Steel Eagle Squadron was known for its elite reputation and demanding standards. Every pilot here was supposed to be the best of the best, yet Sarah still felt like she was constantly auditioning for acceptance. "Tower, Steel Eagle 1 requesting clearance for takeoff." Major Harrison's voice crackled over the radio. As squadron leader, he would be flying point with 5 other aircraft following in formation. Sarah was flying as Steel Eagle 6, the final position in the group, a placement that some might see as less important but she understood was actually quite strategic. Steel Eagle formation, you are cleared for takeoff. Winds are light at 5 knots from the northwest. Have a safe flight. One by one, the jets roared down the runway and lifted into the morning sky. Sarah felt the familiar thrill as her aircraft left the ground, the powerful engine pushing her back in her seat as she climbed toward the assigned altitude. This was where she felt most at home, in the cockpit, with nothing between her and the vast blue sky but skill, training, and determination. The formation flew smoothly toward the patrol sector, maintaining radio silence except for necessary communications. Sarah monitored her instruments carefully, keeping perfect position relative to the other aircraft while scanning the horizon for any signs of activity. Her radar screen showed only friendly contacts, but she remained alert. Combat situations could develop quickly, and there was rarely advance warning. Steel Eagles, this is Control. We're showing unidentified aircraft approaching from the northeast, bearing 045, approximately 60 miles out, and closing. Recommend you investigate and establish identification. Major Harrison's voice came through the communications system with crisp authority. Copy that, Control. Steel Eagles, adjust heading to 045 and increase altitude to 30,000 feet. Maintain defensive formation and prepare for possible contact. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, but her hands remained steady on the controls. This was what she had trained for, what she had dreamed about since childhood. The formation turned northeast, climbing toward the reported contacts while maintaining disciplined spacing. As they approached the area, Sarah's radar began picking up multiple contacts. Control, Steel Eagle 6 has multiple bogies on scope. Count 4 aircraft, heading southwest at high speed. Copy, Steel Eagle 6. Can you identify aircraft type? Sarah adjusted her radar parameters and studied the returns carefully. Her training in aircraft identification had been thorough, and she prided herself on her ability to distinguish between different aircraft signatures. Control, radar signature suggests enemy fighters, possibly MiG-29s based on speed and maneuvering characteristics. Major Harrison's voice carried a note of skepticism. Steel Eagle 6, confirm your identification. Are you certain about aircraft type? Sarah double-checked her readings before responding. She knew that any uncertainty on her part would be seized upon as evidence of inexperience. Confirmed, Steel Eagle 1. For aircraft consistent with MiG-29 signature, altitude approximately 28,000 feet and climbing. Control, Steel Eagle 1 confirms 4 enemy fighters in Sector 7, requesting permission to engage if they cross into restricted airspace. Steel Eagle 1, you're authorized to engage if hostile aircraft cross the border. Maintain defensive posture until they commit to aggressive action. The tension in Sarah's cockpit was palpable as she watched the enemy aircraft approach. They were flying in a loose formation, clearly probing the border defenses and testing response times. This was a common tactic. Send fighters close to the boundary to gather intelligence about defensive capabilities and reaction procedures. Steel Eagles, maintain formation and prepare for possible engagement. If they cross the line, we respond immediately and decisively. Sarah checked her weapons systems one final time. Her aircraft carried a full complement of air-to-air missiles, both short and medium range, plus the internal cannon for close-range combat. She had fired these weapons countless times in training, achieving some of the highest accuracy scores in her class, but this would be her first time in actual combat. The minutes ticked by slowly as both formations approached each other. Sarah could see the vapor trails of the enemy aircraft in the distance, for distinct lines against the blue sky. Her radar showed them maintaining course directly toward the border, apparently intent on testing the defensive response. Control, Steel Eagle 1. Bogies are maintaining heading and speed. Estimate they will cross border in approximately 3 minutes. Copy, Steel Eagle 1. You're clear to engage when hostile aircraft cross into our airspace. Rules of engagement are in effect. Sarah felt a familiar calm settle over her, the same feeling she had experienced during her most challenging training exercises. All the doubt, all the skeptical glances, all the questions about whether she belonged here seemed to fade away. In this moment, she was simply a pilot with a mission to complete and the skills to do it. The enemy aircraft continued their approach, now clearly visible as dark specks against the horizon. Sarah could see why they had chosen this particular route. It was a straight path toward a strategically important city, and crossing here would give them maximum intelligence value while minimizing their time in hostile airspace. Steel Eagle 1, Control. Hostile aircraft have crossed the border. You are cleared hot. Repeat, you are cleared to engage. Major Harrison's voice was steady and professional. Copy, Control. Steel Eagles, engage the enemy. Maintain formation discipline and watch your six. Let's show them what happens when they mess with us. The peaceful morning patrol had suddenly transformed into Sarah's first real combat mission. As she prepared to engage the enemy, she thought briefly about all the people who had doubted her ability to reach this moment. Now she would have a chance to prove them wrong with actions rather than words. The enemy fighters had spread out into combat formation, clearly preparing for engagement rather than attempting to retreat. This wasn't going to be a simple intercept and escort mission. It was going to be a real dogfight with real weapons and real consequences. Sarah took a deep breath and focused on her training. Everything she had learned, every hour of practice, every simulation and exercise had led to this moment. She was ready to show the world what a female fighter pilot could do when given the chance to prove herself in actual combat. The radio crackled with terse communications as both formations maneuvered for position. Sarah maintained her place in the Steel Eagles formation while scanning for threats and opportunities. Her first real test was about to begin, and she was determined to pass it with flying colors. The first missile launch came without warning. Sarah saw the white trail streaking across the sky towards Steel Eagle 3, piloted by Lieutenant Rodriguez. Her training kicked in instantly, and she called out the threat over the radio. Steel Eagle 3, missile inbound from your 2 o'clock. Recommend immediate evasive action. Rodriguez banked hard left and deployed countermeasures, the chaff, and flare dispensers creating a brilliant cloud behind his aircraft. The enemy missile, confused by the electronic deception, detonated harmlessly several hundred feet away. But the engagement had begun in earnest now, and there was no turning back. All Steel Eagles, weapons free. Take them down. Major Harrison's command echoed through Sarah's headset as the formation split apart, each pilot seeking advantageous position against the enemy fighters. Sarah found herself facing off against a MiG-29 that had broken away from the enemy formation and was attempting to gain altitude advantage. The pilot was skilled, pulling his aircraft into a steep climb while turning to bring his weapons to bear. Sarah recognized the tactic from her tactical training. He was trying to force her into a climbing fight where his aircraft's superior thrust-to-weight ratio would give him the edge. Instead of following him up, Sarah rolled inverted and pulled into a split-S maneuver, diving below the enemy fighter and using gravity to build speed. It was a risky move that put her temporarily in a vulnerable position, but it also allowed her to maintain energy while forcing her opponent to commit to his climb. The MiG pilot realized his mistake too late. As he reached the top of his climb and began to turn back toward the fight, Sarah was already positioning herself for a shot from below. Her radar-locked tone filled the cockpit with its urgent warbling as she selected a medium-range missile and waited for the optimal firing solution. Steel Eagle 6 has tone on Bogey 2, she announced, following proper combat protocols even as her heart pounded with adrenaline. The enemy pilot was desperately trying to break her lock, throwing his aircraft into violent maneuvers that would have been impossible for a less capable pilot to follow. But Sarah had always excelled at predicting her opponent's movements. During training exercises, her instructors had noted her unusual ability to anticipate enemy actions and position herself accordingly. Now that skill was being put to the ultimate test against a real adversary who was fighting for his life. The MiG pilot rolled hard right and pulled into a tight turn, trying to force an overshoot that would reverse their positions. Sarah anticipated the move and adjusted her own flight path to maintain her advantage. Her missile lock remained solid despite the enemy's evasive actions. Fox 2, Sarah called out as she fired her AM-9 Sidewinder missile. The heat-seeking weapon streaked away from her aircraft, its infrared sensor locked onto the hot exhaust of the enemy fighter. She watched its white contrail arc through the sky, making minute corrections as it closed the distance to its target. The MiG pilot saw the missile coming and desperately deployed countermeasures, filling the sky with flares in an attempt to decoy the incoming weapon. For a moment, Sarah thought her shot might miss, as the missile seemed to waver in its flight path. But the Sidewinder's advanced seeker head wasn't fooled by the crude deception. It maintained its lock on the hottest signature, which was the enemy aircraft's engine exhaust. The explosion was visible even from several miles away, a bright orange flash followed by an expanding cloud of black smoke. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and soberness as she watched the enemy fighter break apart and begin its final descent. This was her first confirmed kill, a milestone that every fighter pilot understood but few celebrated. Another human being had just died, even though he had been trying to kill her moments before. Splash 1, she announced over the radio, using the standard terminology for a confirmed enemy kill. Around her, the dogfight continued as the remaining Steel Eagles engaged the other 3 enemy fighters. Sarah quickly scanned the tactical situation to identify where she was most needed. Steel Eagle 4 was in trouble, being pursued by 2 enemy fighters who were coordinating their attack to trap him in a crossfire. Lieutenant Phillips was a good pilot, but he was outnumbered and running out of maneuvering room. Steel Eagle 4. Steel Eagle 6 is moving to assist. Continue evasive maneuvers and try to draw them toward me. Without waiting for a response, Sarah banked toward the developing engagement, pushing her throttle to military power to close the distance quickly. The 2 MiGs were so focused on their attack that they hadn't noticed her approach, giving her the element of surprise. She selected her cannon for this engagement, wanting to conserve her remaining missiles for other threats. The M61 Vulcan cannon was a devastating weapon at close range, capable of firing over 6,000 rounds per minute. But it required precise positioning and timing to be effective against a maneuvering target. The lead MiG was just settling into firing position behind Phillips when Sarah opened fire. The stream of 20mm shells tore through the air where the enemy fighter would be in another second, the timing calculated with split-second precision. The MiG pilot, seeing the tracers flash past his cockpit, broke off his attack and turned to face this new threat. But his wingman continued pursuing Phillips, apparently determined to complete his attack run despite the changed tactical situation. Sarah watched in alarm as she saw the telltale flash of cannon fire from the second MiG, followed immediately by the bright streak of tracer rounds converging on Phillips' aircraft. Steel Eagle 4 is hit. Phillips' voice crackled over the radio, tight with pain and concentration. I've got fire warnings in the engine compartment and losing power. Attempting to reach friendly territory. The wounded F-16 began trailing black smoke as Phillips fought to keep his damaged aircraft in the air. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the enemy pilot who had shot him, but she forced herself to remain calm and focused. Emotion had no place in aerial combat. Only cold calculation and precise execution would see her through. The MiG that had broken off from Phillips was now turning back towards Sarah, apparently confident that he could handle a single opponent. His aircraft pulled into a climbing turn, trying to use superior altitude to gain an advantage for the next phase of their duel. Sarah had seen this pattern before in training scenarios. The enemy pilot was experienced and skilled, using classic Soviet air combat doctrine to position himself for a slashing attack from above. But Sarah had studied these tactics extensively and had developed specific countermeasures for each one. Instead of trying to match his climb, she maintained her altitude and began a series of barrel rolls that made her aircraft a difficult target while allowing her to keep the enemy in sight. The MiG pilot committed to his attack run, diving down from above while trying to line up a shot with his own cannon. Sarah waited until the last possible moment before pulling into a sharp defensive spiral, the G-forces pressing her deep into her seat as she maneuvered to avoid the incoming fire. Red traces flashed past her canopy, close enough that she could see individual shells zipping by. The enemy pilot had good aim, but Sarah's defensive flying was just a fraction better. As the MiG flashed past beneath her, Sarah rolled inverted and pulled through into a pursuit curve, using the enemy's high speed against him. The Soviet-built fighter was fast, but its high speed made it difficult to turn quickly. Sarah's F-16, with its superior maneuverability, could reverse direction much more rapidly. Within seconds, she had turned the tables completely. The hunter had become the hunted, and now it was the MiG pilot who was desperately trying to escape Sarah's pursuit. She could see him pulling hard GS in an attempt to break her lock, but his aircraft was already at the edge of its performance envelope. "Come on," Sarah muttered to herself as she worked to get into firing position. "Just a little more." Her radar lock tone suddenly filled the cockpit as she achieved a perfect setup for another missile shot. The enemy pilot was directly ahead of her, well within range, with no obstacles between them. It was a textbook engagement geometry that any weapons instructor would approve. But before she could fire, her attention was caught by urgent radio chatter from the other side of the engagement area. Steel Eagle 2 had been hit and was in serious trouble, his aircraft badly damaged and barely controllable. Major Harrison was calling for immediate assistance, his usual calm demeanor cracking under the stress of seeing his men in danger. Sarah faced a split-second decision that would define her reputation for years to come. She could take the easy shot at the MiG directly in front of her, scoring another kill and enhancing her own record. Or she could break off her attack and rush to help her fellow pilot, potentially saving his life, but allowing her current opponent to escape. The choice, when it came, wasn't really a choice at all. Sarah broke her lock and banked hard toward the distress call, leaving the enemy fighter behind as she raced to help her squadron mate. Personal glory meant nothing compared to the life of a fellow pilot, especially one who was counting on her for rescue. Steel Eagle 2. Steel Eagle 6 is en route to assist. What's your status? 6. My aircraft is shot to pieces. I've lost hydraulics, and my stick is barely responding. Engine is running rough, and I'm losing altitude. I don't think I can make it back to base. Sarah could hear the fear in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Flying a badly damaged aircraft was every pilot's nightmare, and she knew that every second counted if she was going to help him survive. As she approached his position, she could see the extent of the damage. His F-16 was trailing fire from multiple hits, and large pieces of the airframe were missing entirely. It was a miracle that the aircraft was still flying at all, and Sarah knew that it wouldn't stay airborne much longer without immediate intervention. The enemy fighter that had caused all this damage was still in the area, apparently preparing for another attack run to finish off the wounded American aircraft. Sarah realized that she would have to deal with this threat before she could provide any meaningful assistance to her colleague. But first, she needed to assess the tactical situation more carefully. How many enemy fighters were left? Where were the other members of her squadron? And, most importantly, could she single-handedly protect a damaged aircraft while simultaneously engaging multiple threats? The answers to these questions would determine not only her own survival, but the fate of at least one fellow pilot who was depending on her skills and courage to see him safely home. Sarah rapidly assessed the chaotic battlefield spread across 30 square miles of sky. Steel Eagle 2 was limping along at reduced altitude, his aircraft barely controllable and losing fuel through ruptured tanks. Steel Eagle 4, Phillips, was also damaged, but managing to maintain formation despite his engine problems. Major Harrison was engaged with the remaining enemy fighters about 10 miles to the north, his voice terse and professional over the radio as he coordinated the ongoing fight. But it was the tactical picture that worried Sarah most. Her radar showed 2 additional contacts approaching from the east, reinforcements that would tip the balance heavily in favor of the enemy. The original 4 fighters had been reduced to 2, but now 4 fresh aircraft were entering the combat zone, and her own squadron was scattered and partially damaged. Control, Steel Eagle 6. Be advised we have multiple aircraft inbound from bearing 090, approximately 20 miles out and closing fast. Request immediate backup. Steel Eagle 6, Control copies. No additional assets available for immediate support. Nearest fighters are 40 minutes out. You're on your own for now. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. 40 minutes might as well be 40 hours in aerial combat. The fight would be long over by then, one way or another. She looked at her fuel gauge and weapon status. Enough gas for maybe 20 more minutes of combat flying, and only 2 missiles remaining plus her cannon. Not encouraging odds against 6 enemy fighters. Steel Eagle 2. What's your maximum speed in current configuration? 6. I can barely maintain 400 knots, and that's pushing it. Any faster, and I think this thing will come apart. Sarah did quick calculations in her head. At that speed, it would take nearly 15 minutes for the damaged aircraft to reach friendly airspace where ground-based air defenses could provide protection. 15 minutes during which she would need to single-handedly protect 2 wounded aircraft against superior numbers. The first of the approaching enemy fighters was already close enough to appear on her targeting radar. MiG-29s again, flying in a loose combat spread that would allow them to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. These pilots were good. They weren't rushing in like amateur hotheads, but were setting up a coordinated assault that would be difficult to counter. All Steel Eagles, this is 6. We're about to be outnumbered 2-1, and we have wounded birds that can't maneuver effectively. I'm going to try to buy us some time, but I need everyone to start moving toward home right now. Major Harrison's voice crackled through the static. -6. We don't abandon the fight while we still have weapons and fuel. Sarah respected her squadron leader's courage, but she could see the tactical reality more clearly from her position. Sir, with respect, Phillips and Johnson can't fight in their current condition. If we stay and duke it out, we're going to lose aircraft and pilots. I can hold them off long enough for the damaged birds to get clear, then we can withdraw in good order. There was a long pause before Harrison responded. Sarah could imagine him weighing the options, his natural instinct to fight against the cold mathematics of aerial warfare. Finally, his voice came back quieter but firm. Roger, 6. Phillips and Johnson, head for home best possible speed. The rest of us will cover your withdrawal. Sarah was already turning toward the incoming threat, her mind shifting into the hyper-focused state that had served her so well throughout training. Everything else faded away, the doubts, the pressure to prove herself, even the fear that was natural in any combat situation. There was only the enemy, her aircraft, and the mission that had to be completed. The lead MiG was closing rapidly, and Sarah could see that the pilot was skilled and aggressive. Instead of hanging back to coordinate with his wingmen, he was pressing forward to engage immediately, probably hoping to score a quick kill before the Americans could organize an effective defense. Sarah met his challenge head-on, pointing her nose directly at the enemy fighter in what pilots called a notch maneuver. To an outside observer, it might have looked like suicide, 2 aircraft screaming toward each other at a combined speed of over 1,000 miles per hour. But Sarah knew that this aggressive approach would force the enemy pilot to make a critical decision under extreme pressure. The MiG pilot broke first, pulling up and to the right in an attempt to avoid a collision while maintaining an attack position. Sarah had anticipated this move and was already rolling left and pulling into a climbing turn that would put her above and behind the enemy fighter as he completed his evasive maneuver. Her radar lock tone sounded almost immediately as she achieved perfect firing position. The enemy pilot was still focused on his escape maneuver and hadn't realized that he had flown directly into Sarah's engagement envelope. At this range, with this geometry, even a rookie pilot couldn't miss. Fox 2. Sarah's second Sidewinder streaked away from her aircraft, its heat-seeking sensor locked onto the MiG's hot exhaust. The enemy pilot saw the launch and began desperate evasive action, but he was too close and in too poor a position to avoid the incoming missile. The explosion lit up the sky for the second time that morning as another enemy fighter disintegrated under the impact of American ordnance. Sarah felt a grim satisfaction as she watched the debris tumble toward the ground far below. 2 down, but the odds were still heavily against her small formation. "Splash 2, she announced, then immediately began scanning for the next threat. The remaining MiGs were spreading out to attack from multiple directions, and she knew that her success against the first 2 fighters had probably earned their respect and their concentrated attention. "Steel Eagle 6, you're drawing a lot of interest over there," Phillips called from his damaged aircraft. "I count 4 more bandits converging on your position." Sarah could see them too, dark specks against the blue sky that were growing larger by the second. The enemy pilots had abandoned any pretense of caution and were closing in for a coordinated attack that would be almost impossible to survive against such overwhelming odds. But Sarah had one advantage that the enemy couldn't take away from her: intimate knowledge of her aircraft capabilities and her own skill level. She knew exactly what the F-16 could do in her hands, and more importantly, she knew what it couldn't do. That knowledge would be critical in the next few minutes. The first attack came from high and to the right, a diving assault that was perfectly executed according to standard Soviet doctrine. Sarah broke hard left and pulled into a defensive spiral, using the F-16's superior turn rate to force the attacking MiG into an overshoot. As the enemy fighter flashed past, she reversed her turn and fired a brief burst from her cannon, not expecting to hit but hoping to discourage further attacks from that direction. Almost immediately, the second MiG attacked from the opposite quarter, forcing Sarah to reverse her turn again and defend against this new threat. The enemy pilots were working together beautifully, keeping her constantly defensive and unable to mount any kind of counterattack. Sarah realized that she was caught in a classic scissors maneuver, a tactical trap where multiple attackers coordinate their assaults to keep a single defender constantly reacting to threats. If she continued to fight defensively, she would eventually make a mistake or run out of energy, and then the enemy would close in for the kill. She needed to change the dynamic of the engagement, but with 4 enemy fighters attacking in coordination, her options were severely limited. Any aggressive move would expose her to attack from the other aircraft, while continued defensive flying would eventually result in her defeat. The solution, when it came to her, was both simple and terrifyingly dangerous. Instead of trying to fight all 4 aircraft simultaneously, she would have to separate them and engage them one at a time. But to do that, she would need to take enormous risks that would have been unthinkable in a training scenario. As the third MiG began its attack run, Sarah did something that violated every rule of defensive flying she had ever been taught. Instead of turning away from the threat, she turned directly toward it, accelerating into a head-on engagement that put both aircraft on a collision course. The enemy pilot, expecting standard evasive action, was caught completely off guard by Sarah's aggressive response. At the last possible second, he broke off his attack and pulled hard right to avoid a collision, putting himself in a vulnerable position as he tried to reposition for another assault. Sarah was ready for his evasive action and had already begun her own maneuver to take advantage of his predictable response. As the MiG pulled through its turn, she was there waiting with her cannon lined up perfectly on his flight path. The burst of 20mm shells was brief, but devastatingly accurate. The MiG's canopy exploded in a shower of glass and metal as the high-explosive rounds tore through the cockpit area. The aircraft immediately went out of control, tumbling through the sky as its pilot either dead or unconscious at the controls. 3 down, Sarah called out, but she had no time to celebrate as the remaining enemy fighters pressed their attack with renewed fury. The loss of their comrade had clearly enraged them, and their coordinated assault became even more aggressive and determined. Sarah found herself fighting for her life against odds that should have been impossible to overcome. Her aircraft was taking hits now. She could feel the impacts through the airframe and see warning lights beginning to illuminate on her instrument panel. But somehow she kept flying, kept fighting, kept maneuvering to stay alive for just a few more seconds. In the distance, she could see that Phillips and Johnson had made good progress toward friendly territory, but they still had several minutes of flying before they would be safe. Every second she could keep the enemy fighters occupied was another second closer to survival for her wounded squadron mates. The fourth MiG pilot was the most skilled of the group, and he had learned from watching his comrades' mistakes. Instead of pressing aggressive attacks that exposed him to counterfire, he began using hidden, run tactics, making brief firing passes before breaking off to reposition for another assault. Sarah could feel her aircraft becoming sluggish as damage accumulated from multiple hits. Her hydraulic pressure was dropping steadily, and several of her flight control systems were showing degraded performance. But her F-16 was a tough machine designed to absorb punishment and keep flying, and she trusted it to hold together for as long as she needed it to. The final phase of the engagement was about to begin, and Sarah knew that everything would be decided in the next few minutes. Either she would find a way to defeat the remaining enemy fighters, or her luck would finally run out, and she would join the growing list of casualties from this morning's mission. The battle had been raging for nearly 15 minutes when Sarah realized her tactical situation had fundamentally changed. What had started as a 6-on-6 engagement had become a desperate running fight, with her single aircraft facing 3 remaining enemy fighters while trying to protect her wounded squadron mates. Her fuel was running low, her aircraft was damaged, and the enemy pilots were showing no signs of breaking off their relentless pursuit. But something else had changed too. The initial skepticism and doubt that had surrounded her assignment to the Steel Eagles seemed like ancient history now. Over the radio, she could hear the voices of her fellow pilots. Voices that carried respect, admiration, and something approaching awe as they called out tactical information and encouragement. Steel Eagle 6, you're doing incredible work out there. Major Harrison's voice carried clearly through the static. I count 4 confirmed kills and 2 probables. Outstanding flying. Sarah didn't have time to feel pride in the compliment. The nearest MiG was setting up for another attack run, and she needed every bit of concentration to stay alive for the next 30 seconds. Her aircraft shuddered as another burst of cannon fire peppered her port wing, and she felt the flight controls become even more sluggish in response. Warning, warning, hydraulic failure. Her aircraft's computer announced in its calm, electronic voice. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that her primary flight control system had finally succumbed to battle damage. She was now flying on backup systems that provided much less responsive control authority. The MiG pilot apparently sensed her vulnerability and pressed his attack more aggressively, closing to point-blank range where his cannon would be most effective. Sarah threw her damaged aircraft into a desperate barrel roll, using every trick she had ever learned to make herself a difficult target. Shells punched through her fuselage in multiple locations, and Sarah felt the aircraft lurch as something vital was hit. Her engine temperature began climbing rapidly, and she realized that her cooling systems had been damaged. If the engine overheated, she would be a sitting duck. But the enemy pilot had made a critical mistake in his eagerness to finish her off. By closing to such short range and focusing so intently on his attack, he had lost situational awareness of the broader tactical picture. He didn't see Major Harrison approaching from high and behind until it was far too late. Fox 2. Harrison's missile announcement was music to Sarah's ears as she watched the Sidewinder streak past her damaged aircraft and impact the MiG with devastating effect. The enemy fighter exploded in a brilliant fireball that lit up the entire sky, its debris raining down over several square miles of countryside. "Thanks for the assist, Major," Sarah called out, her voice tight with the strain of controlling her battle-damaged aircraft. That was getting a little too close for comfort. "My pleasure, 6. That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. How's your aircraft holding up? Sarah scanned her instruments and damage indicators, trying to assess her situation honestly. I've got hydraulic failures, engine running hot, multiple system warnings, and flight controls that feel like they're connected with rubber bands. But she's still flying, and that's what counts. The remaining 2 enemy fighters had apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Seeing their formation decimated by the American pilots, they were withdrawing toward their own territory at maximum speed. Sarah watched them go with mixed feelings. Relief that the immediate threat was over, but frustration that 2 of the attackers would escape to fight another day. Control, Steel Eagle formation. We have successfully engaged and defeated enemy incursion, confirming 6 enemy aircraft destroyed, 2 withdrawn. We have multiple damaged aircraft requiring immediate priority handling for landing. Steel Eagle formation. Control copies 6 confirmed kills. Outstanding work. You are clear direct to base. Priority handling approved. Emergency equipment is standing by. The flight back to base was one of the longest 20 minutes of Sarah's life. Her F-16 was barely holding together, requiring constant attention to keep it flying straight and level. The engine temperature continued climbing despite her best efforts to manage the cooling systems, and she could see fuel streaming from ruptured tanks in both wings. Phillips and Johnson were in similar straits, their aircraft showing visible battle damage as they limped along at reduced speed. But they were alive, and they were going home, something that had seemed impossible just an hour earlier when they were outnumbered and under coordinated attack. Steel Eagle 6, you've got quite a bit of battle damage visible from here, Phillips called out as they approached the airfield. Your port wing looks like Swiss cheese, and there's definitely fuel leaking from multiple locations. Sarah looked out at her wing and was startled by what she saw. Large holes were punched completely through the aluminum skin, and hydraulic fluid was streaming from severed lines. It was amazing that the aircraft was still controllable at all, much less capable of sustained flight. Tower, Steel Eagle 6 requesting emergency approach. I've got multiple system failures and significant structural damage. I'm going to need the crash trucks standing by. Steel Eagle 6, tower copies. You're cleared for straight-in approach to runway 27. Fire and rescue equipment is positioning now. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. Emergency equipment reports ready. As Sarah lined up for her approach, she reflected on the morning's events. When she had walked out to her aircraft just a few hours earlier, she had been focused on proving that she deserved her place in the squadron. Now, having shot down 4 enemy fighters and helped save the lives of her fellow pilots, she realized that the proof was already complete. But the landing would be her final test. With damaged flight controls and an aircraft that was barely responding to her inputs, getting safely on the ground would require every bit of skill and experience she possessed. A single mistake could result in disaster, negating all of her morning's accomplishments. Steel Eagle 6, you're looking good on approach. Airspeed and glide path are right on target. Sarah could see the runway ahead of her, a long strip of concrete that represented safety and survival. But she could also feel her aircraft becoming more unstable as she reduced power and began her final descent. The damaged flight controls were making it almost impossible to maintain precise control, and she had to make constant corrections to stay on the proper approach path. "Come on, baby," she whispered to her aircraft. "Just a little bit more. Get me down in one piece, and I promise I'll never ask you to do anything like this again." The F-16 seemed to respond to her encouragement, or perhaps her improved technique was finding ways to work around the battle damage. Whatever the reason, the approach stabilized as she crossed the runway threshold and began her final flare for landing. The touchdown was harder than normal, but Sarah managed to keep the aircraft centered on the runway centerline despite the compromised controls. As soon as the main landing gear made contact with the concrete, she deployed her drag chute and began applying wheel brakes to bring the damaged fighter to a stop. Fire trucks and ambulances raced alongside her aircraft as it rolled down the runway, their crews ready to respond immediately if anything went wrong. But The F-16 rolled to a normal stop at the far end of the runway, and Sarah shut down the engine with a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. As she climbed down from the cockpit, Sarah was surrounded by ground crew members who were amazed at the extent of battle damage her aircraft had sustained. The port wing was riddled with holes, the fuselage showed multiple impact points, and various fluids were leaking from damaged systems throughout the airframe. "Captain, I can't believe you flew this thing home," the crew chief said as he surveyed the damage. "By all rights, this aircraft should have broken apart in midair. I count at least 40 separate impact points, and that's just what I can see from here." Sarah looked back at her faithful F-16 with new appreciation for its rugged construction and reliable systems. The aircraft had taken tremendous punishment, but had continued to fly and fight until the mission was complete. It was exactly the kind of trustworthy machine that a fighter pilot needed to survive in combat. Major Harrison approached as Sarah completed her post-flight inspection, his expression a mixture of professional admiration and personal respect that she had never seen before. "Captain Chun, I owe you an apology. I had my doubts about having a woman in the squadron, but what you did up there today was absolutely extraordinary. You saved the lives of at least 2 pilots, and you handled yourself like a seasoned combat veteran." Sarah felt a warm glow of satisfaction at his words, but she tried to keep her response modest and professional. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing my job. Any pilot in the squadron would have done the same thing under those circumstances." "No, Captain, that's not true. What you did required exceptional skill, courage, and tactical judgment. 6 confirmed kills in a single engagement is almost unheard of in modern aerial combat. You've just made history." As word of the morning's action spread throughout the base, Sarah found herself at the center of attention in a way that was both gratifying and slightly uncomfortable. Other pilots, ground crew members, and support staff all wanted to hear first-hand accounts of the dogfight and to congratulate her on her remarkable performance. But the attention that meant the most to her came from her fellow squadron members. Phillips and Johnson both made special efforts to thank her personally for her role in ensuring their survival. The respect and camaraderie in their voices told her that she had finally, truly earned her place among the Steel Eagles. 3 weeks after the dogfight that had made her famous, Captain Sarah Chun sat in the base commander's office, still somewhat stunned by the whirlwind of events that had followed her combat mission. The morning that had started with skeptical glances from her colleagues had transformed her from an outsider trying to prove herself into one of the most respected pilots in the entire Air Force. Colonel Matthews, the wing commander, finished reading from the official commendation as Sarah stood at attention. "For extraordinary heroism and exceptional flying skill in aerial combat against superior enemy forces, Captain Sarah Chun is hereby awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster. Her actions during the engagement of October 15th resulted in 6 confirmed enemy kills and the successful protection of damaged friendly aircraft, representing one of the most outstanding individual performances in the history of modern air combat." As the colonel pinned the medal to her uniform, Sarah thought about all the people who had helped her reach this moment. Her father, who had first shown her the wonder of flight. Her instructors, who had pushed her to excel despite the additional challenges she faced. And her fellow pilots, who had finally accepted her as an equal after seeing what she could accomplish when given the chance to prove herself. The ceremony was attended by dignitaries from throughout the military hierarchy, including the Chief of Staff of the Air Force himself. But the presence that meant the most to Sarah was that of her Steel Eagles squadron mates, who had requested permission to attend in full dress uniform to honor their colleagues' achievement. After the formal ceremony concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by reporters and military officials who wanted to interview her about the engagement and its significance for women in combat aviation. She answered their questions as professionally as possible, but inside she was still somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden transformation in how others viewed her capabilities. "Captain Chun," one reporter asked, "do you think your success will open doors for other women who want to become fighter pilots?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. I hope that what happened up there demonstrates that the most important qualifications for fighter pilots are skill, training, and dedication, not gender. Women have been proving themselves in aviation for decades, and I'm honored to be part of that tradition. Major Harrison, now wearing his own medal for his role in the engagement, waited until the media interviews were concluded before approaching Sarah privately. The relationship between them had changed dramatically since that morning 3 weeks ago, evolving from skepticism and barely concealed doubt to genuine mutual respect and friendship. "Sarah, I wanted to talk to you about your next assignment," he said as they walked away from the crowd of officials and reporters. "There's been a lot of interest in your experience and capabilities from some very high levels in the Pentagon." Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "What kind of interest, sir?" "They're forming a new test unit to evaluate advanced fighter aircraft and tactics. It's going to be staffed with the best pilots from every service, and your name is at the top of their list. It would mean promotion to major and assignment to some of the most advanced aircraft in the world." The opportunity was everything Sarah had dreamed of since she first decided to become a fighter pilot. Test flying represented the cutting edge of aviation technology, and the chance to help develop the next generation of military aircraft was incredibly appealing. But it would also mean leaving the Steel Eagles just as she had finally earned her place among them. "Can I have some time to think about it?" she asked. Harrison smiled. "Of course, but don't take too long. They want an answer within the week." That evening, Sarah walked out to the flight line where her replacement F-16 was parked. The aircraft that had carried her through the dogfight had been declared a total loss due to battle damage, but the Air Force had immediately provided her with a brand new fighter to replace it. The gleaming aircraft sat under the hangar lights like a faithful horse waiting for its rider. As she performed her evening inspection of the aircraft, a ritual she had maintained since flight school, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The doubters and skeptics seemed like ancient history now, their questions answered definitively by the smoking wreckage of 6 enemy fighters scattered across the countryside. Phillips approached as she finished her inspection, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the squadron's ready room. His own aircraft had been repaired and returned to service, and he was already flying combat missions again despite having nearly been shot down just weeks earlier. "Heard about the test pilot opportunity," he said as he handed her one of the cups. "That's a pretty big deal. Not many pilots get offered assignments like that." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, enjoying its warmth against the cool evening air. "I'm still trying to decide if it's the right move. I've finally found my place here at the squadron, and part of me hates to leave just when things are working out so well." "You know what I think?" Phillips said. "I think you've already proven everything you need to prove here. 6 kills in 1 engagement, bringing home a shot-up aircraft that should have crashed. There's not much left for you to accomplish in this assignment. Maybe it's time to take your skills to the next level and see what you can do with even more advanced aircraft." Sarah knew that he was right, but the decision still wasn't easy. The Steel Eagles had become more than just a military unit to her. They had become a family that had finally accepted her after years of struggle and proving herself. Leaving them would be like leaving home just when she had finally found where she belonged. Over the next few days, Sarah sought advice from everyone whose opinion she respected. Her father, reached by phone at the family farm in Kansas, was predictably supportive. "Sweetheart, you've spent your whole life pushing boundaries and challenging expectations. This sounds like just another opportunity to do what you do best." Colonel Williams, her old flight instructor, was equally encouraging when she called him for guidance. "Sarah, test flying is where the real innovation happens in aviation. If you want to help shape the future of fighter aircraft, that's the assignment that will let you do it. You've proven yourself as a combat pilot. Now go prove yourself as a test pilot." But it was her conversation with Major Harrison that finally helped her make the decision. "Sarah, I'm going to miss having you in the squadron, but I'd be doing you a disservice if I tried to talk you out of this opportunity. You've got skills that could benefit the entire Air Force, not just our little unit. And besides, we'll always be able to say we had the famous Sarah Chun flying with us before she became a legend. The morning she was scheduled to give her answer, Sarah woke before dawn and drove out to watch the sunrise from the end of the runway. It was the same runway where she had made that harrowing landing in her battle-damaged aircraft, and where she had first touched down as a new member of the Steel Eagles Squadron 6 months earlier. As the sun painted the eastern sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Sarah thought about all the women who would follow in her footsteps. Her success had already inspired dozens of young women to apply for pilot training, and the Air Force had announced plans to significantly increase female participation in combat aviation programs. That was perhaps the most important result of the entire experience. Not the medals, not the fame, not even the satisfaction of proving her critics wrong, but the knowledge that other women would face fewer barriers and less skepticism because of what she had accomplished in the skies over hostile territory. When she walked into Major Harrison's office an hour later, Sarah's decision was clear. "Sir, I'm accepting the test pilot assignment. I think it's time for me to take on new challenges and see how much more I can learn about flying." Harrison smiled and shook her hand warmly. "I think that's the right decision, Sarah. The Air Force is lucky to have pilots like you pushing the envelope and exploring what's possible. Just promise me you'll be careful with those experimental aircraft. They could be even more dangerous than enemy fighters." 2 months later, Sarah stood on the tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base in California, looking up at the sleek lines of an aircraft that represented the future of military aviation. The experimental fighter was unlike anything she had ever flown, incorporating technologies that seemed almost science-fictional in their advancement. But as she walked toward the aircraft for her first test flight, Sarah felt the same excitement and confidence that had carried her through every challenge of her career. The skeptical voices that had once questioned her place in a cockpit were silent now, replaced by the quiet respect of colleagues who knew exactly what she was capable of accomplishing. As she settled into the cockpit and began her pre-flight checks, Sarah smiled at the thought of how far she had come from that nervous young woman who had first reported to the Steel Eagle Squadron. The journey had been difficult, sometimes dangerous, and often frustrating, but every challenge had made her a better pilot and a stronger person. The experimental fighter's engines spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder, and Sarah felt the familiar thrill of anticipation that came before every flight. Somewhere high above the desert, new challenges and new opportunities were waiting to be discovered. And Captain Sarah Chun, fighter pilot, combat veteran, and pioneer, was ready to meet them with the same skill and determination that had carried her through every test of her remarkable career. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and Sarah advanced the throttles, feeling the tremendous power of the advanced engines push her back in her seat as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. As she lifted off into the clear California sky, she carried with her the knowledge that she had not only achieved her own dreams, but had helped make those same dreams possible for countless other women who would follow in her contrails.